So I mentioned that Paint is the place to put drawing code. Let's look at two examples that illustrate this, drawing lines and drawing images. Don't worry too much about all the details yet. We'll come back in later slides and explain each of these commands in detail. Instead, for now, just try to understand the general idea. Okay, first, drawing lines. So we said that you normally use import statements for applets and that you always extend the applet class. So we do that. And then I said that most of the time you have instance variables in classes, and applets are classes, so you have some instance variables here. And I said that most of the time you do some initialization that doesn't need to be repeated every time the screen is redrawn. You do that in init. And so here I set the foreground and the background colors. I only need to do that once. They're not going to change over time. So no reason to set the foreground and the background color in Paint where it gets invoked repeatedly. And in real life applets inside browsers, the end user cannot interactively stretch the applet, can't change its size. So in a real life applet, the width and the height can't change, so you might as well look those up in the init method, store them in some instance variables, and then just use the instance variables in the Paint method. Okay, so we have some import statements so that Java can recognize the classes that we use. We extend applet because the browser was going to call certain methods behind the scenes. Java needs to know those methods are there. We have some instance variables for data that persists, so we can store the width and the height in init and read it in Paint. And finally, the drawing. So there's two main points about the drawing. The first is this argument here. So the applet class does not have a method called drawLine, and it does not have a method called drawImage. Instead, Java passes a graphics object. Some people call it a pen object. It passes a graphics object to the Paint method, and the graphics object, the pen object, is the one that has the drawLine or the drawImage method. This is much more reusable so that other kinds of windows can also do drawing in the same manner. Okay, so point number one about drawing is you don't call the applets drawLine method. There isn't one. You call the graphics drawLine method, and the system passes the graphics object, the pen object, to you automatically. The second point has to do with the coordinate system. Most of us think of 0, 0 in a graph as being the bottom left corner. But in Java, and in fact in many programming languages that support GUIs, 0, 0 is the top left corner. So this part here that says draw from 0, 0 to half the width, half the height, you might think that draws from the bottom left corner diagonally up into the center, but it actually draws from the top left corner diagonally down into the center. Okay, let's try this. So in real life, if you're going to deploy, you need to make an HTML file, put the compiled Java class and the HTML file on a web server, and then access it from a web browser. But just for practice, forget all that. Don't even write an HTML file. Don't bother with a web server. Just go into Eclipse and run the Java code. Let's try that. Okay, so I'm in my Java code, and I right-click, Run as Java Applet. As soon as I click that, Eclipse will make a temporary HTML file that has the proper applet tag, and then it'll pass that HTML file to a mini little Java-enabled browser called Applet Viewer. And so I see that you get a diagonal line from the top left corner down into the center, not from the bottom left corner up into the center. Okay, so that was the Java code. In real life, you also need HTML code, but for the purposes of practicing, for the purpose of this lesson, don't bother writing the HTML file, don't bother deploying to a server. But if I did this, I could have more than one applet tag in the same file, and when I loaded it in the browser, I would see more than one applet displayed. Okay, so that was drawing lines. Let's also take just a kind of a brief intro, we'll come back in detail, and look at drawing images. And again, it's just kind of the general structure of applets I want to get across here. So you have the import statements, you extend app as usual, but again, you have an instance variable. But this time, the instance variable doesn't store a number, it stores an image. Paint is going to be called over and over again. If you cover up the applet and re-expose it, Paint gets called again. You don't want to reload the image every time because sending it across the internet is slow. So you load the image in the init method and store it in the instance variable, and you draw the image in the Paint method. Now, we'll see in the upcoming slides that behind the scenes there's some threads going on, and it's a little bit more complicated than it appears at first blush. But the basic idea is that init runs only once. Paint can run many times. So things that are slow and don't need to be repeated, like loading an image across the internet, should be done in init. But the drawing code that needs to be repeated is done in Paint. Okay, so if I try this out, I go to my Java code. Once I'm in my Java code, I right-click, Run As, Java Applet. Eclipse makes a temporary HTML file, runs the HTML file, and I can see the image. Now notice that my applet was not the right size. So the benefit of actually writing an HTML file is you can give it a size, where if you run from Eclipse, you're only running the Java code, and Eclipse doesn't know how big to make the applet. So there's still a little mini program called Applet Viewer. And if you really want the applet to initially come up in the right size and not have to stretch it, you can write a little HTML file and go in the command line and pass it to Applet Viewer. But that's not important for the purpose of learning in this example. All right, so that was the Java code for loading an image. In real life, you'll also need an HTML file that refers to it, and then you'll load that HTML file in a browser.